Off the northern tip of Scotland, ringed by wind-battered islands, sits a stretch of grey water called Scapa Flow. From a boat on a bad day, it looks like nothing. Empty sea, empty sky, the kind of place gulls complain about. The wind here comes off the North Atlantic, with nothing to slow it down for 3,000 miles. Scapa Flow itself is enormous, a natural harbor wide enough to hide an entire navy, which is exactly why the Royal Navy used it as a home base through 2 world wars. But under that gray surface sits the wreckage of the largest act of naval self-destruction in history. In the summer of 1919, 74 warships of Germany's high seas fleet went to the bottom in a single afternoon, scuttled by their own crews. 400,000 tons of steel, gone in a few hours. What happened to that steel afterward is stranger than the sinking itself. It ended up inside hospital scanners, inside space probes, inside some of the most sensitive scientific instruments ever built, and almost nobody who uses them knows where the metal came from. To understand how that happened, go back to the winter of 1918. The armistice had just ended 4 years of slaughter on the Western Front, and the Allies faced an awkward question. What do you do with an enemy navy that never actually lost a major fleet battle? The peace terms hadn't been settled yet, and nobody wanted 74 German warships sitting in a home port, while the negotiators argued in Paris. Under the agreement, Germany's high seas fleet would be disarmed and interned somewhere neutral until the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The British picked Scapa Flow, the same wind-scoured anchorage that had sheltered their own Grand Fleet for the entire war. On November 21, 1918, 250 Allied warships escorted the Germans in. Admiral Sir David Beatty watched from the deck of his flagship as 74 vessels, 11 dreadnought battleships, 5 battle cruisers, 8 light cruisers, 50 destroyers, steamed in a single silent line into the Firth of Forth before being routed north to the Orkneys. For the German crews, it was a public humiliation played out in front of the entire Royal Navy. Ships that had traded broadsides at Jutland only 2 years earlier, the battleships Friedrich der Grosse, König, and Markgraf, the battlecruisers Hindenburg, Derfflinger, and Seydlitz, arrived stripped of their gun breech blocks, their radios, their ammunition. A fleet built to fight was reduced to an anchored museum of itself. Command of the interned fleet fell to Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter. For 7 months, he and a skeleton crew of roughly 20,000 men sat trapped aboard rusting ships in a cold, rain-soaked harbor with almost nothing to do. Morale collapsed fast. Sailors' councils, inspired by the revolution back home in Germany, took hold on several ships and openly challenged their officers. Supplies ran short. Coal was scarce, food was worse, and boredom did the rest. Some of von Reuter's own officers stopped following his orders entirely, and for a while it was an open question whether the fleet would fall apart from within before the British ever had to do anything about it. The British, under Vice Admiral Sir Sidney Fremantle, controlled the mail and the newspapers reaching the German ships, and von Reuter spent months almost completely cut off from what was actually happening at the peace talks in Paris. By June 1919, the pressure broke him. Von Reuter got hold of a smuggled, days-old copy of the Times and learned the peace terms were brutal, demanding the fleet's outright surrender to the Allies. He also read that Germany had until June 21st to sign the treaty or face renewed war. What he did not know, because nobody told him, was that the deadline had quietly been pushed back to June 23rd. Convinced his country was about to reject the terms and that fighting was about to resume, and bound by an officer's code that said no German warship would ever be handed over intact to an enemy, von Reuter made his decision alone. He would destroy the fleet himself, and he would do it before anyone could stop him. For weeks, under cover of routine maintenance, his crews quietly got the ships ready to die. Watertight doors were unbolted and left open. Sea valves and torpedo tubes below the waterline were loosened, just enough to fail on command. Bulkheads were breached in secret. Bilge pumps were sabotaged so they could not be restarted. Tools were hidden where a boarding party would never think to look. Levers were oiled so they would pull easily, fast, without a sound that might give the plan away. The morning of June 21, 1919, came in bright, clear, and calm, unusually so for Orkney. At 9, Vice Admiral Fremantle led the British 1st Battle Squadron out to the Pentland Firth for a torpedo drill that had been scheduled for weeks. The guard dropped to a handful of trawlers, watching over 74 capital ships, an almost comically thin screen for what was still, on paper, most of a navy. Von Reuter saw his opening. At 10 o'clock, in full dress uniform, he stood on the bridge of his flagship, the light cruiser Emden, and sent the signal by flag and lamp. To anyone watching from outside, it looked like routine paperwork. To every German captain in the harbor, it was the order they had been waiting 7 months to receive. What happened next took the British completely off guard. Across the anchorage, German crews ran the Imperial War Ensign up their mainmasts next to the scuttling flags, in plain sight of anyone who cared to look. Below decks, men swung sledgehammers into seacock valves, smashed pipes with axes, threw the valve handles into the bilge where no one could reach them, and locked the sea chests wide open. Water came in fast, roaring through compartments that had been built, at enormous cost, to keep it out. The hulls groaned and creaked as they filled. Within 20 minutes, the battleship Friedrich der Grosse was listing hard to starboard, faster than anyone expected. Men threw their sea chests and life rafts overboard and jumped from the armor belts into water cold enough to kill in minutes. By 11:20, the light cruiser Frankfurt was going down by the bow. At 12:16, Friedrich der Grosse rolled over completely, her red anti-fouling paint catching the light one last time before she went stern first into the mud, with a boom that carried across the water to the hills. British trawler crews scrambled to stop what they could, which was not much. Officers boarded the sinking ships with sidearms drawn, ordering German sailors to reverse the valves or show them where the damage had been done. It made no difference. The tools were already at the bottom of the bilge, the hand wheels already smashed flat. On the Markgraf, her captain, Walter Schumann, refused to call off the scuttling even at gunpoint. A British boarding party shot him dead on his own quarterdeck. 9 German sailors died that day, and 16 more were wounded, the final casualties of a war that had, on paper, already ended months earlier. One by one, the rest went down. Hindenburg settled upright and almost gentle onto the sand, her masts left standing above the waterline, like the skeleton of a building nobody finished. Derflinger, nicknamed the Iron Dog by the British after her performance at Jutland, rolled over with air trapped inside her hull, keeping her afloat upside down for several long minutes before she finally slipped under. By 5 o'clock, when Fremantle's squadron came racing back to save what they could, it was already over. 52 of the 74 interned ships were on the bottom, 15 of 16 capital ships among them. It remains the single largest loss of warship tonnage in one day in recorded history. Von Reuter, watching from a British destroyer where he had been taken into custody, reportedly said only that he was satisfied his duty had been done. For years, the Admiralty saw the wrecks as junk, a hazard to navigation, and nothing more than that. Everyone agreed the ships sat too deep and were too badly damaged to ever come back up. Everyone was wrong. In the early 1920s, a self-taught engineer named Ernest Cox, a scrap metal dealer who had never raised so much as a rowboat before this, bought the salvage rights to 28 destroyers and several of the capital ships from the Admiralty for next to nothing. People started calling him the man who bought the Navy. What Cox pulled off next is one of the strangest engineering feats of the 20th century. He brought in floating docks, crane barges, and teams of divers who worked in total darkness, in freezing water, wrapped in heavy copper helmets and canvas suits that weighed almost as much as the men inside them. To raise a battleship lying upside down, some of them over 25,000 tons, his team sealed every valve, porthole, and torn seam with oxyacetylene torches, then bolted airlocks onto the exposed hull. Compressors on the surface forced air down through hoses into the wreck. The water had nowhere to go but out. The work was slow, cold, and dangerous, done mostly by touch and water too dark to see a hand in front of a mask, and not every diver who went down came back up without injury. Slowly, over hours, the trapped air won out over the crushing weight of the steel, and an upturned battleship would break the surface like something surfacing from a much older, much darker world. Tugs hauled the inverted hulls across open water to Rosyth or Inverkeithing, where they were finally righted, dry-docked, and cut apart piece by piece for scrap. Between 1924 and 1939, Cox and the salvage crews that followed him raised 45 of the sunken ships, among them the battlecruisers Hindenburg, Moltke, Seydlitz, and von der Tann, and the battleship Kaiser. Then the Second World War broke out in September 1939, and the work stopped overnight, with no warning. 7 ships were still down there when it did. The battleships König, Kronprinz Wilhelm, and Markgraf, and the light cruisers Brummer, Dresden, Köln, and Karlsruhe, sitting quietly in 70 to 150 feet of water. For decades, those 7 ships sat forgotten in the cold Scottish mud. Nobody was thinking about them at all. But the world outside Scapa Flow was changing in ways no naval engineer of 1910 could ever have imagined. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb went off in the desert outside Trinity, New Mexico. Hiroshima and Nagasaki followed within weeks. Over the next 3 decades, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China set off more than 500 atmospheric nuclear tests, detonating warheads high in the stratosphere and scattering radioactive isotopes, cobalt-60, strontium-90, cesium-137, into the upper atmosphere, where the wind carried them around the entire planet. Some of those isotopes take decades to decay. Cesium-137 alone has a half-life of roughly 30 years, long enough that its fingerprint is still detectable in soil and ice cores laid down half a century ago. That fallout got into everything, including steel. Every furnace on Earth pumps enormous volumes of ordinary air through molten iron to burn off impurities, whether it is an old blast furnace or a modern oxygen converter. After 1945, that ambient air carried trace amounts of fallout with it, and every single batch of steel made anywhere in the world from that point on absorbed a little of it into its structure. For a bridge, a car door, a kitchen appliance, that trace radiation means absolutely nothing. But scientists were starting to build instruments sensitive enough for it to matter a great deal. Geiger counters, whole-body radiation counters used in cancer wards, particle detectors built for physics experiments, deep space sensors bound for NASA satellites and interplanetary probes, encase one of those in ordinary post-war steel, and the metal's own faint radioactivity drowns out the very signal it is supposed to detect, like trying to hear a whisper next to a running engine. Some of these instruments were built to register a single stray particle passing through a detector the size of a refrigerator. Against that kind of sensitivity, even steel considered clean by every ordinary industrial standard was still far too noisy to use. What those instruments needed was steel made before Trinity, steel that had never once touched contaminated air. Somebody eventually worked out where the largest known supply of it on the planet happened to be sitting, the bottom of Scapa Flow. The High Seas Fleet had been built between 1908 and 1916, from Krupp cemented steel, decades before anyone had split an atom or even imagined doing so. And because the wreck sat under 60 or more feet of water the whole time, the sea itself acted as a shield, keeping decades of Cold War fallout from ever reaching the metal underneath. By the late 1960s, a new kind of salvage operation moved in. Companies like Scapa Flow Salvage were not interested in raising whole ships anymore, the way Cox had. They wanted the metal itself, nothing more, and they went after it with underwater explosives and hydraulic cutters, stripping the 12-inch thick Krupp armor belts, the bulkheads around the gun barbettes, the drive shafts, anything dense enough to be worth the trip down. The steel that came up was remarkably pure. Tons of it were shipped to metallurgy plants around the world, melted down in oxygen-free chambers so it would not pick up any modern contamination in the process, then machined into shielding and sensor housings for some of the most precise scientific instruments on the planet. Buyers rarely advertised where the raw material had actually come from. A German battleship sunk in a Scottish harbor in 1919 is not exactly a selling point on a lab equipment invoice, even when it is the entire reason the equipment works at all. Steel like this has gone into radiation detectors used in medical research, and it has long been rumored, though NASA has never confirmed it outright, that some of it found its way into shielding on deep space probes. Metal forged in the Ruhr Valley to arm an empire ended up doing something close to the opposite of what it was built for. For a while, this made the iron sitting in Scapa Flow some of the most valuable scrap metal on Earth, worth far more per ton than anything coming out of an ordinary scrapyard. Low background steel, priced almost like a precious metal. That did not last. By the late 1990s, Atmospheric testing had been banned by treaty for decades. The fallout already in the air had mostly decayed away, and steelmakers had worked out how to scrub the gases used in modern furnaces. Low background steel from old warships was no longer strictly necessary. It is still used sometimes, for the most demanding equipment, but modern methods can now manufacture it synthetically, at considerable expense. Around the same time, attitudes toward the wrecks themselves shifted. People stopped thinking of them as a convenient underwater quarry and started treating them the way they probably should have from the very start, as war graves, and as some of the last intact relics of an entire naval era that no longer exists anywhere else on Earth. In 2001, the British government placed all 7 remaining wrecks under formal protection as scheduled monuments. Cutting them apart for scrap became a criminal offense. Salvage divers were replaced by technical scuba divers, and the wrecks became one of the most sought-after diving destinations anywhere in the world. Every year, thousands of divers travel to the remote Orkney Islands for exactly this. They descend through cold, green water and swim along hulls furred with soft coral, past gun turrets whose 15-inch barrels still point uselessly into the silt, through open passageways crowded with cod and brittle stars, running a bare hand along steel plating that once helped decide the balance of power across an entire continent. Ships built to project raw industrial violence are reefs now, full of fish, quietly falling apart in the cold. What is left of them holds the memory of a whole generation of German and British sailors who died fighting the largest naval powers the world had ever built against each other. Divers who have spent time on the wrecks describe the same thing over and over: how quiet it is down there, how the fish move around the gun turrets like the guns were always meant to be part of the reef, how easy it is to forget, floating past a barnacle-covered bulkhead, that men were still inside some of these hulls when they went down. The steel that once armored a fleet built for war is sitting today inside hospital wards and, if the rumors are true, somewhere out past Jupiter, still doing its job in total silence. Nobody who forged it in a furnace in 1916 could have guessed, in 1,000 years of guessing, where it would end up.